I'm Joseph Mullins. I am an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota. I'm an economist and I work on topics to do with human capital development or skill formation in childhood. I'm particularly interested in designing government policies that don't necessarily directly but often indirectly shape skill development by providing economic support to vulnerable households or households in poverty. So a lot of what I've been interested in lately is the design of cash transfers or the safety net, and something that I've discovered in my research. So, I started off in this because I was interested in how these programs are designed in the US particularly. The US is special in that the safety net is more of a patchwork type of thing, and it's natural to wonder what the returns might be in the long run to increasing the resources that households have access to. Now that's still an open question, but a lot of what I have been able to contribute, I think, to that literature is thinking about sort of classic problems in public economics, where we think about the trade-off between wanting to redistribute to poorer households while minimizing the distortions to their incentives to work and develop their own human capital and just generally be attached to the labor force. One of the things that really surprised me is that when you properly account for the long-run return of even small gains in children's cognitive and behavioral skills in childhood, it has a huge impact on the calculus of that policy design problem. And so what you find is that while much of public economics has been preoccupied with the work incentives of providing economic support, cash transfers at the bottom of the income distribution, when you factor in the potential benefits of additional time that parents have with their children, that can actually, in terms of doing the accounting properly, it can swamp the short-run costs, distortionary costs of disincentivizing labor supply. Now, there's a lot of work still to be done there because it's very hard to the data won't readily tell us what the returns are to an extra hour at home, and that number is going to be very different based on the options that people have available to them, their care options, who's around, is there a grandparent or a family member. All that we really know is there seems to be at least some marginal evidence that on average there are negative impacts from reducing time with kids. So that exercise has got me really interested in trying to understand a lot better what shapes the cost of parental time, or what shapes the benefits of parental time. Can we use other policies like childcare to perhaps moderate any loss in skill that would come from a reduction in time that children, especially young children, get with their parents? Those are big questions, and that connects, I think, with my second area of research, which is using economic theory to aggregate a lot of the great research that's been done in the last 15, 20 years. We've seen a rapid expansion in the amount of evidence on the effect of specific programs in specific contexts on child development outcomes, on their health, their cognitive ability, their social abilities. What we don't really have is, what I don't think we've seen enough of is an effort to put all that together for a big lesson in policy. What is the sum of this evidence telling us about how we should design the safety net? And so that's sort of the main driver of, I guess, a twin in my research agenda, which is to think about methods and tools for aggregating evidence using economic theory, where it's not always true, but this is a context, I think, in which it's particularly true that economic theory has stood up fairly well in explaining labor supply behavior and explaining the responses people have to changes in their incentives. And so it makes a lot of sense to think about sort of applying or trying to apply some sort of global or universal framework for understanding all of the evidence around how parents and families respond to changes in incentives, how that affects their resources and decisions inside the household, and how that affects the skill development outcomes of their kids. And consequently, what are the implications for that in the long run? So I think a lot of what I'm drawn to at the moment, or excited about doing, is pushing those frameworks harder and harder to try to, I think, get numbers that we can really believe in and take to policymakers with more confidence than we might if we were forced to do this today and pull some numbers off the shelf, or do something ourselves, which is often the standard in economics. If we want to conduct a policy exercise, the assumption is that we'll go and find the data to do that, as opposed to going and look at the mountains of evidence that exist already and try to put that all together for some kind of like global lesson, let's say. The most cost-effective way to increase household income is to subsidize work, which is what the Earned Income Tax Credit is doing. It is what the Child Tax Credit does at particular parts of the schedule, or has done in the past. And so the question then becomes, do these policies, which are more effective at boosting income today, are they more effective in boosting, sort of the net present value of our resources when we think about the effect on kids' human capital? And there's where the trade-off might appear if, by subsidizing employment and increasing labor force attachment, we're reducing time investment, or somehow affecting skill development in the household. So the evidence there is mixed as to whether parents actually spend less active time with their kids. It's not clear that they do necessarily, but still I think there's some evidence to suggest that there's some kind of indirect effect, whether that's coming from reductions in supervision or increase in stress inside the household. It does seem that some kind of trade-off exists there. And I think most people's intuition would suggest that trade-off isn't fixed, but it's malleable to other policies like provision of high-quality childcare or subsidies for childcare and these kinds of things. So a lot of what the policy design problem comes down to is we're fairly confident that resources matter for many reasons, particularly for skill development. Now, obviously, for general well-being, these things matter. But then the question remains of like, what is the most efficient, quote unquote, from an economic perspective? What's the most efficient way to be doing this? And I think there's been some clear, without thinking about what happens to children, we thought we'd had the answers to these things for a long time, and certainly you can see that in the way policy in the United States and other countries has evolved. From income maintenance schemes or welfare programs that typically didn't encourage work so much, to programs where that's much more the focus. Of course, in the US, we had welfare reform in the 1990s and the expansion of the Earned Income Tax Credit. These were all pro-work policies where the aim was to increase economic self-sufficiency and foster economic independence and thriving. And I'm not taking a strong stand as to say that those policies are bad, but I do think that the data is asking us, the evidence that exists is asking us to look a bit closer at how those things are designed, and try to do a careful job of all the accounting here, not just what happens in the short run, but also the long run. This connects, I think, with sort of kind of this large-scale research program that I have in mind, that we would like to design assistance policies with the full scope of the evidence in mind. My work to date has sort of taken a microscope to specific settings. I've examined the results of welfare reform experiments in the 1990s, which is studies very specific populations, but provides quite fascinating variation in their incentives to work and participate in cash welfare. I've studied longitudinal data where the data won't directly tell you about the effect of changes in incentives, but methods exist to sort of carefully interpret long panels of data on specific individuals. And I think that one can reasonably and credibly draw lessons from those data sets. But it's a small drop in the bucket in terms of what one could know if one took a more exhaustive approach to thinking about the effect of particular changes in childcare policy on childcare use, on the quality of childcare being used, on ultimately on skill outcomes, major changes to the safety net and in greater populations than the ones that I've been able to study. Certainly, I think the way I think about this is many people have worked very hard to understand some of these things quite well. And it deserves an attempt to formally, through the lens of an economic framework, try to put these lessons together. So, if we think of the safety net in the United States as having multiple arms, food stamps, Medicaid, TANF, childcare subsidies, we have many versions of childcare subsidies on top of publicly provided childcare through Head Start. All of these things are going on, and so I'm not an expert on what's politically feasible, but certainly it would be nice to know how we should be, what's the best way to combine these different arms of the safety net to maximize the possibility that vulnerable kids are able to flourish, not just economically, but
more broadly in society.
So that's a really vague statement of what I would like to work on next, but it's specific in the sense that I think the combination of the question of how to combine childcare policies with cash assistance is really an open question, and I don't know that we've brought all the evidence to bear in a really rigorous way to that question, and that's something that I would like to work on.